Welcome to Leaders Upgraded, the place where people who want to upgrade and fast track their career, their life, and their leadership journey tend to gather. I am your host, Heidi Gardner, and I shall be speaking to the top 10% of the world's leading authors, CEOs, coaches, and thinkers to bring you some of the best and brilliant ideas to fast track your way to success. Would you like an upgrade? Let's do this.
I am super excited because we have an amazing guest joining us today. The topic is smarter collaboration, and our guest, Dr. Heidi Gardner, has been named by Thinkers 50 as the next generation business guru. And she is a distinguished fellow at Harvard Law School and a former professor at Harvard Business School. She's also currently the faculty chair and instructor in multiple executive education programs at both institutions. She has been globally applauded for her work on collaboration, and it has been featured in top publications, of course, like Harvard Business Review and Time Magazine and CNN and all the fabulous places where the thought leadership of people who really matter is featured. So I'm very, very excited that we are going to get this time to talk to her about her book, which is already like a global bestseller and much needed conversation on smarter collaboration. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Heidi Gardner. Welcome, Heidi.
Well, thank you so much. It's great to see you again.
I know I must tell everyone who's listening what the see you again goes back to, which is about, I want to say more than 22 years ago. I was at the Academy of Management conference for new PhD students, and they were taking questions. And a really amazing, confident young woman stood up and asked a question about streamlining her research topic. And I was immediately struck with how well she had framed the question and how she was articulating a question that was on all our minds. Because, the room was full with the legends of the world of academia. And so it was a little bit overwhelming. I'm like, I don't know who she is, but I like her already. So that's that's the background. And then I started writing my book on deep collaboration, and I was doing my research, and I found Heidi again, and she wrote Smart Collaboration, and then after that she wrote Smarter Collaboration, and so we just had to have her on the show. So Heidi, I would love to hear a little bit. Steve Jobs said you can only connect the dots looking backwards. Do you think that day when you stood up and asked that question about refining your focus, and then you did your PhD and these two books, was there some sort of a red thread running through all of this? I'm so
Well,
curious.
Tanvi, I have to tell you, the red thread that runs through all of it goes much further back than my PhD. It actually goes at least back to the times when I was at McKinsey. And so I was at McKinsey for 5 years before I left to go back into academia and start my PhD and so forth. And, I noticed when I was at McKinsey that we often would have two nearly identical teams, both incredibly diverse, but they were identical in the sense that they had people from different walks of life, different professional backgrounds, incredibly smart people, driven, and so forth. And yet sometimes you would have one of those teams that would just create something phenomenal. It would be innovative, it would be impactful. And then you could have a team that was just as qualified, et cetera, and the result would be solid, but frankly, a little bit on the boring side, right? And I saw this again and again as I was leading teams, and I just couldn't put my finger on why it was that some teams were able to tap into this full complement of the brains and the hearts and minds of the people on the team, and other ones just kind of just scratched the surface. And it was a burning question for me. I left, I did my PhD, I studied it as part of my dissertation, and what I discovered as I dug deeper and deeper is that this is really fundamentally a human question. There are so many answers to this. Why are some teams more competent than others at tapping into their members' full expertise? And some of it is the situation. Like, I found that performance pressure puts a lot of blinders on people. that they really
Mm.
fail to appreciate the kind of fullness of others' experiences when each person is really task focused and has their head down. But I also found that there are some intrapersonal things like somebody's ego or their need for control or a whole
Mm.
bunch of other kind of personality type factors. So long
Mm.
story short, yes, there is a red thread, and it probably goes back perhaps subconsciously way before even McKinsey.
Yeah, that's so amazing. So that's the other kind of point of commonality, right? I left some of the people who are tuning in live or listening to the replay may have heard, depending on how old you are, of a company called Arthur Anderson.
Yeah.
And I used to be in Arthur Anderson. And so I kind of saw some of the dynamics that you're talking about yourself. And you're right that it's interesting you bring up this performance pressure part of it, because
Mm,
particularly in the environment that we are leading in right now,
yes.
where we are seeing, first of all, there is a fatigue of the pandemic, which I don't think has fully gone away.
Right.
And then we are restructuring, and trust is on an all-time low, I think, in some ways in organizations. So while collaboration is, it's kind of like almost like an inverse relationship. We need this more than ever before, and yet we are struggling more than ever before.
A
So
hundred
it's
percent.
like, so it's
Yep.
this paradox that we are trying to navigate, right?
Without a doubt. I mean, my first Harvard Business Review article that I wrote, gosh, back in 20, I can't remember what it was, 12 or something like that. It really looked at that paradox of performance pressure. Just when you need people to be their most innovative, their most open-minded, when they're under the kind of pressure where they're supposed to deliver something really tremendous, that's oftentimes, ironically, when they revert to the tried and the true. They go for the least risky option, which is basically something that's been done many times before.
Mm.
And it's unfortunate because people are under pressure for a reason. It's because somebody expects them to bring forward the best they could possibly do. And just in that moment, the brain, does a U-turn and takes them back to something that really isn't the optimal answer in the moment, but it feels safe and
Yes,
comfortable.
yes. And one thing I noticed, and I would love to hear your thoughts on this one, because the pandemic in some ways was this crucible, right? It was such an extreme environment. All the variables were stretched to the max. So
Yes,
of course, it's not an indication of the day-to-day pressures of performance we talk about, but
it was
I
extreme.
saw in a lot of the client teams that I work with, that when the pressure of pandemic, and particularly in countries like India and some of the others where the second wave was brutal, when the pressure became so extreme, they actually did lean on each other,
Mm,
because there was something at stake which was so much bigger.
yeah.
And it almost made me wonder whether is it really performance pressure, or is it performance pressure towards what end? So if
Well,
it's
I think
performance.
that I was always careful, Tanvi, in my research to differentiate between a crisis, right? And
Right.
I mean, clearly the pandemic was a crisis. And
Yes.
it is, it is a very sharp moment in time. And it really is a time, historically, we can look back and see many, many crises over the centuries where
Yeah.
people did pull together despite
Mm.
differences, despite adversity, etc.
Mm.
But
Yeah.
performance pressure really operates differently in the workplace. If
Mm.
there's a crisis in the workplace, there's sort of all hands on deck, and yes, we'll get past our competitive nature. But performance pressure really operates differently. The
Mm.
way we defined performance pressure, it was when there was a lot of scrutiny. People were really looking over somebody's shoulder. They had extremely high expectations, maybe
Mm.
even unrealistic expectations. And it's
Mm.
that sense of needing to deliver that really creates that noise in the brain that makes people behave in suboptimal ways. For
Yeah.
example, we found that under performance pressure, people are much more likely to defer to hierarchy, whether or not
Mm.
the person who has formal authority actually has the right knowledge in that situation. Right.
Mm.
And, fascinating. We were able to study this. We had many, many, many hundreds of professional service firm team members participating in our research. I think it was 620 or so
Mm.
across a number of different organizations in lots of different teams. And we could measure the degree of pressure that they felt like they were under at various points during their projects, and then
Mm.
see the sorts of outcomes associated with it. And what we found is that the people who were identified as experts early on, sometimes in quite particular topics, etc., that expertise was discarded the more the pressure amped up. And so
Mm.
like you and I might know, you're brilliant at this thing. And it's easy to say that at the kickoff team meeting and so forth. But when somebody turns up the heat, I might conveniently forget about your expertise in
Mm.
favor of deferring to somebody who hierarchically is superior.
Right.
And you
It's
think about
almost,
that, like that's the kind of safe move
yes,
organizationally. It's the cover my backside move,
yes.
but it certainly isn't going to get the right answer for the problem for the client, you name it.
No, it's almost like you need to keep overriding the Paleolithic software we have for safety to
Yes.
be able to tap into, the it reminds me of that cartoon you might have seen where a bunch of people are, trying to move logs on, square frames, and somebody comes and offers them a wheel, and they're like, can't you see we're trying to get work done over here? And they're like,
Exactly, exactly. Well, we did find that exactly people were less open to innovation, for
yeah,
example.
yeah.
And there's plenty of research physiologically to show what happens when people are under pressure. They get tunnel vision. They literally can't see peripherally when they're feeling, under a great degree of pressure and things. So it's no surprise that we're not as open-minded either.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Exactly. Which brings me to my next question, which God knows, I think you cannot have a conversation about collaboration without discussing this paradox is, the individual need for competing and shining and being, seen as someone who is, big contributor so that, they can move up the ranks, etc. So there's that individual instinct for
Yeah,
competition.
yeah,
And then we put these teams together where we're like, all right, can you just all like collaborate?
yeah.
And so it's there is that little tussle over there. And I would love to hear, and I think our audience would love to hear, as to, do you think these two pressures are reconcilable?
Oh, 100%. I think there are many elements in the context which will exacerbate a sense of individualism or competition to an
Mhm.
unhealthy degree. And so it really takes leadership to create the context in which collaboration thrives. I think, we can probably all point to incredibly dysfunctional performance and reward systems in an organization.
Yeah.
How many leaders will stand in front of the group at the beginning of the year and, strategy, blah, 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 and we're all in it together. And then the reward system measures people's individual outcomes and rewards them for individual performance. And you think, am I crazy, or did you just say we should work as a team? And yet you're asking me to sacrifice. So
Yes.
Tanvi, what we pursued in our research early on, we wanted to tackle this question, and we gathered data that would allow us to compare two almost identical individuals. So we found, and this was John Ng, one of my research associates back at Harvard Business School, who's since gone on to do many great things in his graduate school and so forth. But with his incredible analytic help, we found in our millions of data records two individuals who were nearly identical to each other. They were, in this case, both partners in a professional firm. They shared a lot of demographic characteristics. They both were men. They had graduated from with their degrees in the same year, all sorts of things. And they were in the same line of work inside this professional services firm. So many things that were very similar, but we were able to pull together lots of different data sources from the firm and map out their collaboration patterns. And what we
Mm.
found is that the first individual, we joke, by the way, that they're twins because they're so close to each other. Right? So twin one, we mapped out his pattern, and you can actually see this visualization. I think it's in chapter 1 of the new book, but he looks a bit like a hub and spoke, right? He's in the center, and he's got lines connecting him to these other partners in his firm. But it's maybe a handful, 5, 6, 7 other partners. Whereas you show twin two's collaboration map, and it's like this crazy, messy spider web with dozens of connections. And it's not just that it's a bigger web, it's a better web. It's higher quality.
Yes.
He's got
Yes.
more diverse people on there. He has
Mm.
different kinds of relationships with people. He works with some incredibly frequently, and he works with some very infrequently, but in a very targeted way. And the
Mm.
punchline here is that we were able to measure their performance outcomes. And it turns out Twin 2, the more collaborative, networked partner in this firm, his performance was 4 times higher than
Mm.
his than his less networked colleague. And his
Mm.
higher performance, we were able to uncover the source of it. I mean, his collaboration, it gave him access to all kinds of market intelligence, even gossip, right? So he knew which of his clients were going to be leaving and moving here and
Yeah.
here. And he heard
Yeah.
about deals early. And I mean, he got all of these informational benefits. He got trust benefits. And so what we were able to show is that although there's a strong perception that if we operate solo, we will be
Mm.
better off because we can claim all the credit, what we
Yes.
demonstrate is you might get 100% of the credit of a very small piece. Whereas if you work in a much more collaborative way, you might only get a small portion of the credit, but the thing you're working on will generate such significantly higher returns
Mm.
that the absolute value of what you get is higher.
Yes.
Now, for some people, Tanvi, they don't care, right? For them, what actually matters is control, right?
Yeah.
I don't need that big thing, and I don't want to work with all these other people, and I don't want to share the limelight. I'd rather
Mm.
get less,
Yeah.
but have it in my control. And
Yes.
that's a legit trade-off for some people. But
Yeah.
we need to know that some people operate like that and be really thoughtful about where in the organization they sit and what role we're asking them to play.
Yeah, it's that African proverb, right? If you want to go fast, go alone, but if you want to go far, go together. And you're right, it is a trade-off. What type of impact do you want to
Yeah.
have, and what are you prioritizing? I mean, myself, or frankly, I think from what I'm hearing your research say is that you could still have your I me myself, but do it in a manner that carries people with you and feeds into to your performance.
To be clear, when we're talking about collaboration, it's not, big group hugs and let's go hold
Yeah.
hands together. We're
Mhm.
talking when we define smarter collaboration as bringing together in a very intentional, thoughtful way
Mm.
people whose perspectives complement one another, people who are in
Yeah.
different functions, different departments, different
Yeah.
geographies, different degrees, different, right? And when you have that diversity of thought, you're
Yeah.
able to tackle much more complex, sophisticated problems than
Yes.
anyone could do on their own. And
Yes.
that's what we mean by getting outcomes, right? You're playing to your sweet spot. You're not trying to be everything to everyone. You really identify what are your genuine strengths, and then
Yeah.
you lean into those, and you don't need to stretch too far away because
Mm.
you've surrounded yourself with that network of people. When there is something that is outside your bounds, you say, I'm going to bring that individual in for that specific piece of work and do it in a really thoughtful way.
Yeah. And I love it. I think it requires a shift in consciousness in the way we talk about collaboration. And one of the things I always tell people is that what do we define as collaboration has to be very clear in our minds as well before
Yes,
we go after it. So
yes,
I appreciate that clarification. This article that you wrote, and it's in the book as well, around the scorecard. I cannot tell you how many people I have recommended that section to, and I send it to all my CEOs and I send it to all my CHRs, and I'm like, listen, there's someone who's finally figured it out. I
yeah.
have not seen such an elegant, powerful, and practical framing
Mhm.
of these, trying to reconcile these dilemmas in a way that makes such beautiful sense and is adaptable to so many different contexts. And I would love for you to share a little bit more because I really just need everybody to adopt it right now. So,
Well, let me start by giving credit where it's due. The co-author to Smarter Collaboration, Ivan Matviak, he and I worked long and hard together, and so much of his hands-on practical experience from the financial services world and private equity and fintech has absolutely informed that scorecard approach. In essence, it doesn't sound like rocket science when we say it this way, but if we are expecting people to collaborate, we need, in fact, to make sure that we are measuring the outcomes of collaboration and rewarding those. So we're not talking about rewarding collaboration per se. We're not paying people to behave in a certain way. We are identifying major outcomes, strategically aligned, important outcomes that can only be accomplished through smarter collaboration. right? So you pick a goal, and that might be, increasing sales of a particular product line to a kind of customer in this geography. Suddenly you realize, well, whom do we need to bring on board in order to accomplish that most effectively? And you could have an individual salesperson out there scrabbling and clawing to get extra, sales on their own, or they could be really clever and team up, upstream in the organization and make sure they're dialed into all of the new product developments, and they're staying informed, and they're sharing their market expertise with other people. And suddenly you start to set these goals that are demanding collaboration, and you make sure you're prioritizing those in the scorecards and rewarding people for accomplishing those big strategically important goals. And the collaboration then will not exactly work itself out, but people will be much more inclined to compromise, negotiate, and collaborate when their scorecard depends on it. Right. So that's a big part of what we talk about. And of course, there's a lot of nuance there to think about.
Yeah.
How do you measure it? It does, I have to admit, fly in the face of a lot of sort of economic theory where they try to convince people to only measure what somebody has direct control over. But by definition, that's very individualistic, right? And that may have been good advice at some point in time. I'm not sure when individuals were able to accomplish what an organization or a firm needed them to do. They were able to do that more or less solo. It's certainly not the case in this incredibly complex and dynamic world that we're living in now. That said, Tanvi, if I can just take another moment to describe the kind of flip side of this, we still recommend that a smaller proportion of somebody's overall appraisal, but nevertheless non-zero, some portion of their appraisal is dependent on their individual outcomes.
Yep.
Why? Well, it's not so much. The first thing people think about is, we want to prevent them from free riding and, only relying on their team members to get all the work done. I think all of us at one point or another must have been scarred by some student project that, when we were working with a bunch of bozos and we're the only one who did some work. And so all we can think about is, wait, what if I'm the only one pulling my weight? But actually, it's almost the opposite reason for having an individual measure in there. It is, first, a small piece is to help people understand how they are progressing. And so you want to have some metrics that people can compare year on year to demonstrate proficiency and increases in performance. So that makes sense. But more importantly, if you know that I have individual metrics, you are not going to suffer from the schmuck syndrome. In other words, you're not going to feel like you could be taken advantage of because somebody is keeping an eye on my individual performance and every other team member's performance, right?
Yeah.
So you're not going to get yourself into the situation where you throw yourself and all of your efforts in, and then afterward find out you were the only one working hard, right?
Yes.
So once people in an organization know that everyone is accountable for their own and the collective performance, it takes away some of that doubt about, wait, can I really trust the system or not?
Yeah, I think the scorecard, when supported by a lot of the other processes that need attention in the team, then becomes this really powerful thing. I think the scorecard alone won't do it, but the absence of the scorecard won't do it either, is the way I'm thinking about it.
100%. I mean, the scorecard is simply a tool, right? And it needs to be incredibly integrated with the way people behave, with the leadership imperatives, and of course with the strategy. And so any of those pieces on their own aren't going to help, aren't going to fully accomplish what you need the organization to do. And yet without the scorecard, as you said, it's much harder to get people to act in the ways that allow them to bring out their best and the best of the people around them.
Right. I'm just curious, in the companies that you're working with, what might stand in the way of adoption of this? Because honestly, to me, it's such an elegant solution, but it also requires rewiring of the way we think about rewards and incentives and some of the traditional ways we have been thinking about bonuses and all of that. And this is so not my field, which is why I'm hoping you can tell us, like, is there hope? Are people waking up? And what does the adoption process look like right now?
Yeah. So let me start with your first question. What stands in the way? And this is not a point of view that makes me very popular, but frankly, a lot of what stands in the way is lack of leadership. And I don't
Mm,
mean lack of people who have titles. I mean lack of people with titles who act as if they are true leaders. And
mm,
so think about it this way. If you have to control the performance of a whole group of people, it's certainly a lot easier if there's some algorithm and data that's captured somewhere. And at the end of the year, you don't have to make a judgment call. You don't have to give feedback to people. Or you just simply say you're, a B minus, or you're a 43 on the whatever scale, right? Or you're in this box of a whatever box matrix, and then walk away, tick tock, like that's it, I'm done. Right? That's
mm,
not leadership. I mean, that's basically communicating what some algorithm has spit out. If you're going to use a more sophisticated and nuanced approach, it demands real leadership. People will have expectations. Okay, if you want me to contribute as part of this team, what are you, dear leader, going to do to create an environment where people say trust one another? Right?
yeah.
What are you going to do to create an environment where we have the resources to communicate with one another across time zones and asynchronously? What are you going to do? And people start asking these very awkward questions of leaders when, in fact, they should be asking those questions all along, but people really only step up and put the demands on leaders when there
Mm,
depends on it. Right. So
yeah.
leadership, or lack of leadership rather, is one of the things that stands in the way of adoption. It's much more comfortable and frankly simpler for people to get by reporting on a mechanical score than it is
Yeah.
to have to make some judgment calls and equip people to be able to work more collaboratively.
Uh, 100%. I was once in performance appraisal discussion, those PDFs, performance development forums kind of thing. And we had the one of the senior most partners in the firm walk in, and then he looks at the scores that everybody got, and he's like, if everybody is this brilliant, why am I not doing like 5 billion additional in revenue
Yeah.
every year?
Yeah.
And if I'm not, then I need you to make sure that they fit on the curve so we know where everyone is. And I just, that was just an example of the mechanical nature in which we just try and, fit everything and everyone without
I mean,
contextualizing.
if I can come at this a little bit more empathetically, maybe back is hard,
Yeah.
right? It's uncomfortable. We'd rather sort of float through life on the periphery of feedback than have to look somebody in the eye and say, "You're not cutting it. Here are the four
Yes.
things that you really need to do better, and I'll
Yeah.
help you in these sorts of ways, but you got to be in it." And having that conversation and looking somebody in the eyes, who you might work with quite closely, and all sorts of things stand in the way, it can be uncomfortable both to give and to receive feedback, right? And so if there is a system that allows you to make it more, I don't know, depersonalized, it's
Yeah.
not surprising that people lean into that. I mean, one thing to think about when it comes to communication of rewards, and this is happening like in the very moment, because a lot of companies around the world are in feedback and appraisal mode at this time. What we often see is a huge mistake among many others that companies make when it comes to performance appraisals is they go to enormous lengths to get the right score or number or outcome or bonus, or you name it, whatever they're trying to decide. And they really do invest a ton, some of these companies, in getting to the right fair and equitable true outcome for somebody, and then they fall down. It was just the Super Bowl here in America, so to use a sports analogy, they're almost at the end zone, and before they get to the goal, they trip, right? And what I mean by that is they go to all of the work, and then they fail to communicate effectively what
Mm,
that score or the bonus level or whatever it is represents. And they fail to have that deep and honest and thorough conversation about what it means and what the person could do differently and how they can interpret it. And it's that meaning that should be
mm,
attached to a score or an outcome. And way too often people just leave the bonus letter on somebody's desk, or they shoot off the email, congrats, you made a 4 out of 5, and fail to follow up with the appropriate, robust conversation.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned conversation, right? Because my book Deep Collaboration, and by the way, do not read Deep Collaboration before you've read Smart and Smarter Collaboration, because it's you have to go through the process before you arrive. There's so much to be done before you just go into deep collaboration. But the book that's coming out has got 5 conversations in it, 5 different conversations teams need to have. And the one that, when I was doing my research and in my work with companies, and I asked them, I said, which one, what's the conversation that is most difficult? So there's the deep inspiration, deep learning, deep friction, deep strategizing, and deep daring. And without doubt, the 2 most common ones that come up are deep friction conversations and deep daring conversations. Hands down. We don't know how to have the difficult conversations, and we don't know how to push the envelope. And it reminds me of one of my partners used to say it, and I loved it when he used to say it. He said, what's wrong with these performance appraisal conversations is that everybody wants to go to heaven, but nobody wants to die. And what he meant by that was that you have to be all in. You can't stand at the periphery and just give this number and be on your way. You have to have those really, really hard conversations.
Without a doubt. Absolutely. And I think organizations should own up to this. They should recognize that kind of friction is uncomfortable for people, and help people cope with it in the best way possible for them. It's one of the pieces we always point out to people is smarter collaboration really requires a fair degree of friction. And it's probably one of the reasons that people hesitate to engage that way, is because they'd rather operate in their own zone and stay comfortable rather than have somebody challenge their thinking or bring in a new set of data or a very different perspective. Because when somebody does that, it challenges me, it challenges my view of the problem or the view of the solution. And we have to have a debate then. We have to challenge each other. We have to have the back and forth and back and forth. And the only thing that stands between that kind of debate and challenge and wrestling with the ideas, between that and making it feel like an interpersonal competition or some kind of unhealthy friction, there is trust. Because if I'm gonna pipe up in a meeting and you're gonna come after my ideas and challenge them and ask me for more evidence and ask me to explain myself and or maybe come in with a really different perspective and say, I see this a completely different issue here. You're seeing it as an environmental challenge and I'm seeing it as a human challenge. We can have that real tough argument, because I know that when you challenge me, Tanvi, you're coming at it from a place of wanting the ideas to get better, right? I'm trusting your motives. Why are you so hard on me? It's because you'd rather pressure test those ideas, the 2 of us, before I go out and try and implement it at a client in a half-baked way, right?
Yeah.
And when I trust you and know that you're going to challenge me like that for the right reason, bring it on, right? If, on the other hand, somebody else is doing that to me and I'm thinking, really, like, are you just trying to make me look foolish in front of these people? Or, are you trying to undermine me? Are you trying to make me second guess myself? Right. I mean, believe me, like in academia, it happens, daily, right? As the joke is in academia, the fights are so big because the crumbs are so small. Right. And so, oftentimes there's, not particularly well-intentioned motives behind people's challenge. And you learn to become defensive in those situations. So, that trust element is just absolutely vital in organizations. When people trust one another, so much more can happen much more effectively.
Yeah. And trust also has so many different slants to it, right? Like we were discussing about expertise-based trust, and then there is the interpersonal trust. And so it can come at different levels. And I always feel like, without interpersonal trust, the expertise-based trust might as well not be there, because, you know,
100%.
it's that famous Harvard Business Review article, right? Which long ago, I don't remember now, about, what was it? Smart jerks and lovable fools, like
Oh,
who
I love that. Yes,
yeah,
absolutely. Absolutely. The premise behind it is that most of us would rather go to the competent jerk.
yes,
Um,
confident. Yeah.
sorry, we'd rather go to the lovable fool, right? We'd
Right.
rather go to somebody who doesn't actually know the answer, but is lovable in the sense of, they're affable and they're easy to get along with and so forth. And way too often we go to the lovable fool rather than the competent jerk. We should go to the person who has the real competence, but we're afraid of getting shot down. Tiziana Casciero was the author of that. I think it's a classic. It's such a good one.
It is. It is. I make sure when I'm teaching at university, they all read it and they all love it because they've experienced it all along. And so, yeah, that article is really, we'll post it in the comments for those people who haven't found it yet. But it's great. So, I'm mindful of the time. So as we kind of start wrapping up, I'm just wondering. We were discussing earlier that the pandemic was a crisis, and so the way we talk about collaboration in different contexts may need us to dial in or out of different frames or variables or thought processes depending on the context. So one context is, okay, you're a professional services firm, you're a manufacturing firm, you're an FMCG, you are media whatever company,
Uh-huh.
right? That's one context. But then there is also where companies are in their life cycle. So a mergers and acquisition context, digital transformation context, etc. Do you think there are differences to be had, and things that we should be thinking about when that life cycle context shifts? Have you noticed anything in your research about that?
Well, it's really interesting. The reason we wrote this new book with different almost use cases for smarter collaboration is some of the different chapters. There is one there on post-merger integration. There's a whole variety of different settings where smarter collaboration really has to take root. If I pick up on one of them, it's third-party collaboration. And so
Mm.
so often we're talking about collaboration within the four metaphorical walls of an organization. But so often these days, it's a network or an ecosystem that's
Yeah.
coming together in order to drive performance, or develop the molecule in the small biotech, and then commercialize it and take it to market in the big life sciences company. So that kind of cross organization collaboration is becoming so much more common. And
Yeah.
yet, what we say is you've got to get it right at home, right? Leaders can't expect their employees or their partners or whomever it is to work well across organizational boundaries if they can't even
Yes.
work well with their own colleagues, right?
Exactly.
So crack it at home. What's standing in the way? We do a diagnostic, every time I'm asked to do a keynote or that sort of thing, we always do a pre-event diagnostic, which is a mini form of this. And now we've developed a process where we go into organizations and we do this full-blown smarter collaboration diagnostic, and we triangulate. In other words, we collect data from a number of different sources and all kind of shine light on the same problem of what's standing in the way of collaboration, and the flip side, which is where smarter collaboration already taking root that can be replicated throughout the organization. And
Mm.
so often when we come in, out of one of those diagnostics and we're presenting back to the executive committee or the board, what we reveal is, I suppose, like all good social science, once you say it out loud, it becomes blindingly evident, right?
Mm.
But until you've gone in, you've collected the data and you've crystallized it, you can support it with the empirical evidence, people don't really want to believe it.
No.
Right. And so, we see this in a cross organizational sort of collaboration sense, that oftentimes we just lose the champion. Right. There's, one person or one department, one team that was really gung ho to make this work. And if you don't have a continual refreshing of who's the champion, that's one of the things that turns up a lot in our diagnostic is you sort of, it never really quite dies, but it just fizzles away to the extent that it's taking more resource than it's worth.
Right. So we have a question from the audience, which is a great one actually. What's the primary difference between skills for smarter collaboration for leaders versus team members? And I like that question because I think there may be some variation, right? We tend to focus so much on the leaders, but the teams need to have certain types of skills as well, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, to that end, we are just launching a Smarter Collaboration 360. So we've got 9 different competency areas laid out where people absolutely need to be up to scratch. And so if we take, we were talking about trust earlier. There's 2 elements of trust and 2 competencies for a great team member that relate to trust. One is demonstrating trust in fellow team members and
Mm.
demonstrating trust in others. And one is to be able to demonstrate one's own trustworthiness.
Yes.
And I think that's what we often miss out is that the onus is on us to send loud, clear, consistent signals that people can trust both our competencies, right? How capable are we? What skills do we have? And our integrity. Right. And it's on us to continually reinforce that we are trustworthy. So one of the skills that team members need to have is that, is really those 2 competencies around trust is demonstrating trust in others and also demonstrating one's own trustworthiness. I think there's another, picking up on one of the other competencies that we have seen trip people up is their ability to flex how hands-on they are in the work that say somebody else is doing and how they flex that kind of hands-on versus hands-off and empowering.
Mm.
And this is one that really takes a lot of, I'm going to use the word maturity. It might not be the preferred word here, but people need to develop a strong sense of when their team needs them to be more deeply involved. And sometimes people will say, well, as a leader, don't you always want to be fully empowering? Well, you don't want to be disempowering, but there are times when your team actually needs you to get in there and roll up your sleeves and be part of the work and make sure that you absolutely understand what it takes to get the work done and you are close enough to the work that you're able to coach people and give them, redirects when necessary. And that ability for people to be hands on versus hands off and to flex it according to the needs of the people around them. It's a
Yeah.
true leadership skill. And it also comes to play when we're working in these highly collaborative environments. How much do we lean in and help other people? And how do we do that proactively when necessary?
Yeah, so many judgment calls to be taken, and also keeping in mind how they will get received. And when you have a relationship of trust, then those that leaning in is seen as support versus micromanaging. And so we keep coming back to the concept of trust. And I don't know, maybe there's something just about seeing you again after 22 years that's making me remember all these classics that one reads, right? There was this article about why, or was it a book now, on why should anyone be led by you?
Yes, yes,
uh,
yes.
right. And
Yeah.
I think it will be great to have one which would be about why should anyone collaborate with you.
Yeah, 100%. I love it. I love it. I love it. Yeah, I mean, it's true, right? One of the other tools that we developed is more of a psychometric tool that people take their own kind of online profile and it helps them understand where they come out on different dimensions.
Yeah.
And unlike the 360, where you actually are supposed to be good at these competencies, or the better you are, the more you and your team will be able to accomplish. But on the profile, it's more of a strengths-based tool. It helps people understand where they are. So are you more of a complex thinker? Do you like to engage at that level of abstraction and philosophy and models and connections and stay way up here? Or do you
Yeah.
really like to take those big crazy ideas and make them happen? Right? Do you
Yeah.
like to get in there and create action plans and just really see progress on this? And the reality is, both of those kinds of individuals, the complex thinkers and the concrete thinkers, are vital to
Yeah.
make work happen, right? Even for innovation, everyone thinks like, oh, you want the blue sky thinkers. Well, if you only have blue sky thinkers, you're going to end up with some brilliantly novel ideas that go precisely nowhere
Yeah.
because you don't have people who are great at execution. Right? The real problem though is in as much as we can all nod our heads, sure, we need complex and concrete thinkers, put those two kinds in a room together and ask them to work together, and it's like cats and dogs, right?
Yeah.
And so, people don't really appreciate the value of somebody who thinks about the world really differently. We
Mm.
tend to just get irritated by them. You're standing
Yeah.
in my way, you're asking silly questions, can't I just crack on and get my work done?
Yeah.
And I think that kind of appreciation for real differences. I don't mean surface level, oh, we look different from what I mean, the real differences in how we think and how we engage with the work. That is where some of the value comes in. And people do need to learn how to work across those differences.
100%. I end up using a lot of archetypes in the work that I do on deep collaboration, which is just that awareness of what's my first cut when I see a situation versus yours, and how might I bridge it versus roll my eyes internally every time you walk through the door. Um,
Completely.
I am really glad we have this question from the audience. I think maybe let's make this a final one because I know it's late at night in Boston. Mark asks, I've worked with a number of teams who used to collaborate well, but are struggling under hybrid ways of working, no anchor days. They all love and want to keep up hybrid remote. Of
Yeah.
course, everyone likes to work from home. So how can they collaborate better under these conditions? And I'm going to just write on that and just throw in a word, which if I didn't use that word, what sort of a LinkedIn Live is this? Do you think AI is impacting any of this in any way? So
Yeah.
two separate questions, but
Yeah,
I'll let
yeah, yeah. Okay, so let me tackle Mark. Love the question, and it's so legit and so on point these days. A few things that I would suggest here, and I'm always welcome to hear other people's suggestions as well. You're welcome to connect with me on LinkedIn and tell me what you'd say. But my advice would be more than ever, we need to make sure everyone understands the purpose of what we're working on. And purpose, I'm using purposefully, right? The purpose, the meaning behind what we are doing and what the actual goal is. And for every single person, how does their piece contribute to that bigger picture? I think that that is getting lost right now. We are feeling sort of atomized and separated and isolated and losing sight of why it is that the work that I'm doing is vital to accomplish this bigger piece and who cares about that bigger piece.
yeah.
Right now, I do work in the healthcare field. Was just prepping yesterday to do some work with a major cancer center. I've worked with the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute here in Boston. When you're doing that kind of work and you're literally curing cancer or treating cancer, it's easy to make a case for why the work is important, right?
Mm.
But sometimes I get a challenge from people in all sorts of esoteric domains, and they say, how do we make the case that what we're doing is really vital? And
Mm.
sometimes it's more of a stretch, but honestly, as a leader, what's more important for you to do than think about the purpose behind this organization,
Yeah.
this piece of the organization? It
Mm.
might be creating jobs and contributing to the economy. It might be creating, safety. There's 100 different ways that we could articulate the value, but making sure as a leader that we stop to do that and refresh it, as often as is needed, and help people understand their piece. That's, really that first step. I would say one other point on the hybrid before I come back to the AI. I do think it's really crucial that people have fun, right? That sounds so absolutely basic, but at
Yes.
the end of the day, so much of what we've done has just become a grind. And it has become so difficult to constantly prove ourselves and to put ourselves out there and not know if we're appreciated. And so I think finding ways to connect on a human level is absolutely vital. For when people have that tough week and they've got, whatever's going on with a family or a neighbor or who knows what, showing that compassion, showing some grace under those situations, I think is really hard. And it makes the fun times that much more natural, right? We can be there for you when we're having a virtual catch up, and we can be there when, the times are tough. So I would say don't lose sight of the fun piece. On the AI, we're doing some super cool research right now on using AI as a collaborative team member. So we
Mm.
were in Western Europe a couple of weeks back and have started a small piece of research with a major consumer brand there. And they have great examples of bringing in they call it a power bot. It's an in-house Gen AI tool, and they are finding really strong use cases to bring the power bot into conversations where they might be missing a team member. We don't have anyone from whatever compliance in the room right now. Run us through the 10 reasons why compliance will be implicated in da 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 da. And the thing will, come up with an answer. And it's really vital to be transparent. Like, okay, this is not what I would say, it's what the bot said, but we really do need to take this into consideration. Like 9 of the 10 things are pretty real. Let's dive into it. What I found fascinating, pardon me, from that company is that they talked about the benefit of attributing some of these ideas to AI. It made it easier for people to challenge when you say, hey, it's not my idea. Go ahead, shoot holes in it. The system came up with it.
Right.
So I thought that was a brilliant take on that.
I love it. Yeah, it's whatever gets it done. And, I've been playing around with AI, and, you have the ability, at least in the paid version, where you can upload your thinking and thought processes, etc., to start training it in your mental models and your, stream of knowledge and consciousness. And I just wonder, right, that in the future, will that be a part of all our jobs, to make sure that, hey, I'm not there, but my bot is, so can you just, see what comes from there? But I love this idea of safety being introduced. I hadn't thought about it. I just love it. I love it. Yeah. All right. We are coming to an end. I really appreciate the time you've taken to be here. I think your work is fundamental to what we are trying to do in our organizations. And I would love for everybody to pick up the book Smart Collaboration and Smarter Collaboration. They both are chock full of real life case studies and examples that you can run with. So Heidi, thank you so much. It was so great to see you after this
Likewise.
Back, and hopefully we'll meet in person again soon. And so thank you everyone who joined in.
That concludes this episode of Leaders Upgraded, but wait. Your journey is just getting started. Go to www.leadersupgraded.com for more insights, more inspiration, and more tools to continue the journey. And if you have someone who you would like to nominate for the podcast, or a particular topic you'd like us to cover, then also visit www.leadersupgraded.com and let us know. If you like this episode, please do share it. Please do subscribe to the podcast. And I look forward to continued upgrades with you. Take care.